Hi, everyone. This is our Bicep community call of September 2023. What is the community call for? I'm going to keep going through these slides, even though it's not new information. It's for you guys, not for us. It's a way to be casual with our community and talk to you guys through the chat and give any announcements or feature reveals that we otherwise wouldn't share. So please use the chat. We have our engineers here and other people on the team, and anyone will be available to answer your questions. If you also want to raise your hands, you can. At the end, we will have the Q&A session, so you can have more of a free-for-all there. Okay, the ODOT 22 released. This will probably be released next week, hopefully, if everything goes through smoothly. The MS Graph provider, I accidentally wrote AAD, but there is a new name for it. I think it's Entra. But this is finally in private preview, which is really exciting. I know some of you have already signed up for it. If you do want to sign up, put your name in chat. I think there might be another round of signups, but it may take a little bit of time because you need your tenant ID and it's a little bit of a complicated process. But it's finally out in private preview and we're working on getting it into public preview. Deployment pane tenant and management group scope support. So if any of you guys have seen the video on the demo on deployment pane UI that Anthony has been working on, there's finally tenant and management group scope support. So that's exciting. Compile time variable imports in both Bicep and Bicep Pram files. Johnny will give a really quick demo on that. We're working on a lot of compile time import support. Bicep Pram files can now reference registry modules. That's something Anthony has been working on, and I think a lot of you guys were excited about. So it supports BR, TS, and JSON paths. And finally, private networking for deployment scripts. This has been an issue for a while, and I'm sorry it's been taking so long. We want to make sure that everything out is perfect. So we now have support for this. We have documentation that's currently being worked on. So we don't have the documentation out yet, and we'll get that out when we release. Hopefully you guys can finally have that support. Okay, future releases. Modular parameters for Bicep Pram. We'll talk about it a little bit at the end because I know some people have been asking for updates, but we are working on that. Engen has been working on that, and he's been a great help. Supplemental and inline parameters also will be talked about at the end by the engineer working on it, Mohammed. This is something also people have been asking about. So we're excited to be able to get that out to you. Okay, we have had hackathon at Microsoft a couple weeks ago. Our team has been working on, I think, 2 or 3 projects that are pretty cool. One of them will be shared next community call, but this one, I will quickly share the video that Ari and his team had prepared. Give me 1 second. And side note, for the hackathon projects, these are things that we're excited to do, but there's no guarantee that these features will be fully worked on and fully prioritized. But it was just some fun projects that our engineers have been wanting to work on for a while and finally got the chance to. And if you guys have any feedback saying that you really want this, any of the hackathon projects, please let us know. We're very open to feedback. Okay, hopefully you guys can hear this. Please let me know if you can't.
Bicep is an open-source domain-specific language developed by Microsoft for defining and deploying Azure resources declaratively. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce you to the AI Copilot for Azure Bicep. This new feature provides a more streamlined and efficient authoring process and addresses the following challenges. Learning Bicep can represent a steep learning curve for transitioning developers. For example, let's look at creating a no key vault resource using Bicep's current language extension capabilities. We can see the IntelliSense of the Visual Studio Code extension. The extension gives us some information about the key vault resource schema, but as authors, we must go outside the editor experience to learn about how to fill a resource body before we have a working draft. We can improve this experience with the Azure Bicep AI Copilot feature, and as a consequence, enhance the productivity of Bicep authors, reducing the time it takes to get to a pull request. Also, our Copilot is able to leverage the collective and historical knowledge on best practices and pre-populate fields with common values so that authors can get past the blank page syndrome and into a development test cycle loop quicker. The Azure Bicep Copilot is designed to align perfectly with the Azure ecosystem. This means it inherently understands Azure resources, their configurations, and the latest stable resource API version schema, as well as the intricacies of Azure deployments. It's not just about completing code, it's about ensuring the code is robust and adheres to best practices for Azure and the Bicep language as defined by the language maintainers. Its knowledge base and suggestion mechanisms are designed to understand Bicep's language constructs, schemas, and best practices. Compared to GitHub Copilot, which is a general purpose tool that provides code suggestions across various languages, Azure Bicep Copilot dives deep into one specific domain to offer unparalleled assistance. GitHub Copilot has other drawbacks, for example, a costly price and a lack of specific suggestions for the Bicep language. Using the Azure Bicep Copilot is easy. All you need to do is have an OpenAI instance endpoint and an API access key, and registering them through the extension installation process. From a business perspective, the Bicep AI Copilot enables Microsoft to combine our cloud capabilities and Azure OpenAI and empower every developer and development team to get to prod faster, more reliably, and using best practices so that they can achieve more and realize their full potential.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Ari, for recording this. And if anyone has any questions or want any feedback, I believe Ari is in this call and can take any feedback or questions. Otherwise, we can move on. So compile time variable imports. Johnny, I think you have a quick demo for this.
Yeah, let me just share my screen. Okay, does everybody see VS Code?
You might want to zoom in, good amount. I think that's good.
Okay. So in the previous release, we included an experimental feature called compile time type imports. The way that worked was you needed to have bicep config.json file where you opt into the experimental feature of compile time imports. With the upcoming release, that will not only include types, but variables as well. So for types, the way this works is you have type statements that are private by default, but if you have a type statement that has the export decorator applied to it, then those types can be imported into a different file. So let's make a main.bicep import from mod.bicep. And so we can pull in the shape type and use it just like a type that we defined in this file, and it's coming from the other file, right? The thing that we added is you can now also export variables. So here we have a variable called small circle. You can pull that in and then use that in this template just as if it were a variable that we defined. Oh, well, you can't use them for m default value. But you can use it as a variable value, just like if it had been defined in this file. Imports of variables are also supported in bicep parameters files. So if we have a bicep param file, let's say that we're using main.bicep, We know that we have to add a shape param. And here we can pull in our small circle from mod.bicep. And if we were to compile this, everything will just be resolved at compile time. So we end up with the value just as if it had been defined in line. And similarly, the value for small circle will get injected into our Bicep template. One thing to note, variables, you can't necessarily export every variable. If we had a param string foo, anytime you refer to a parameter, if a variable makes reference to that parameter, because we don't know the value up front, that will make the variable unexportable. So here we have a value that includes, anywhere within it, a reference to a parameter. If we try to export this, then we'll get a diagnostic saying, we can't do this because it refers to a parameter. And the same thing will happen if a variable refers to a module or a resource, which is normally allowed, but not for exports. So that is going to be included in the next release, and I look forward to hearing your feedback on that. Thanks. Back to you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Ronnie. There are some questions, or I guess just, asking about import, export, user-defined functions.
Oh, so that is next up on the docket, but we wanted to have types and variables in place beforehand because functions can, I believe, refer to either. So yeah, when you import a function, it may include types and it may include variables within its closure. But we should be working on that one soon.
Sounds good. And there was a question about the AI Copilot feature. So this was a hackathon project that one of our engineers had worked on, but like Bernie said, it's an internal project. There's no commitment to ship the feature. We would like to, but we don't have any priority for it. So if you guys are really interested in it, we definitely would want feedback and we can prioritize it. But for now, there's no commitment. Okay. Requested updates. So the supplemental inline parameters for Bicep, Param, and CLI, there were some questions about this, and I think a couple community calls ago, we asked if environmental variables were enough, and almost everyone said no, it wouldn't be a good substitute. So we have been doing some work in design on this. Mohammed, do you want to talk about this one?
Yes, I can share my screen real quick. Yep. So as Stephanie mentioned, that we've been trying to do design work on this, and the main reason it's taken so long is that we are trying to provide a complete experience in terms of validation. So like just to give you guys an example, let's say you're doing a deployment, you have a parameter that you pass in inline, and in your Bicep file, let's say you have a restriction like this, where a certain value is allowed, and if you don't provide the correct value, an example like this, if we just do a simple implementation, this wouldn't be caught at compile time, and this will be caught by ARM engine. And we want to make sure that we can catch it at compile time, and that has been quite difficult to implement. We came up with one design where we were thinking about creating a validate params command where you can pass in some parameters and validate it. And we went along with it for a bit, but But as we just find out for the future for parameters file, and we were going through the use cases that we can have for parameter files, we decided to scratch that design and go back with a different design. So that has been the main reason that why this has taken so long. And right now we have finalized on a design at all the use cases that you can have with parameter file. So that's this issue. And hopefully we can get it done on time this time. And we're hoping that by next month, you guys would have some supplemental parameter capability. One thing I want to point out is that we're still quite limiting it. Like we're limiting the scope of this so that you would be only be allowed to pass it one bicep file with one parameters file, and then some supplemental parameters like this. And we can potentially expand the scope later, but for now, it's limited. One thing we are planning on to potentially completely block is multiple bicep params file, as that is gonna cost a lot of the cost of that is too high. And also we cannot provide an alternative for that with import statements. So yeah, if anybody have any questions, let me know.
Cool. Thanks, Mohammed. Hopefully there aren't too many questions. I don't see any in the chat so far, so I guess we can move on. Someone had asked about the 4 megabyte limit on ARM. Basically, we're investigating ways to increase the limit, but we don't have an ETA that we can really share. This is something that we've been looking into for a while, though. Hopefully, we can figure this out soon. Recommended approach for multi-stage pipelines. That's another question that came up. So in Microsoft Learn, there are several different ways documented to do this. Let me try to find the link for that. But the different ways are Azure Pipelines, GitHub Actions, and MS Build, which we don't really recommend MS Build right now because it's pretty old. But like said in the comment, we don't really have one specific way that we say you should use CI/CD for multi-stage pipelines. And we say basically use try any of these methods for your own experiences, whatever's best for your environment. And if anyone has any other questions about that, you could definitely ask. Our engineers are here to answer. And the managed by property issue, I'm not sure if the person who asked this question is here today, but Johnny, do you think you could talk on this quickly?
Sure. So if I'm remembering correctly, there is a property that you can specify when you're declaring a resource group that should accept null or a string, but you can't pass null through the ARM API, and therefore you can't through Bicep. This is probably something that we should address on the ARM API side. We really try to make sure that any property that's optional will also accept null, or allow that property to be omitted. So we'll look into that. Probably going to work on it in ARM rather than Bicep, though.
Thanks, Johnny. All right, and we didn't have too many things to present this month, unfortunately. So we are on to Q&A, and we can also end early if there are no other questions. Yes, Gara?
I put a question in the chat about OCI compliant registry support. Like if we're not going to use ACR for, or if we don't want to use ACR for Bicep registries using something like GitHub Container Registry, what's the roadmap for that feature?
Shenglong, Johnny, do you have context on this? I know that Marston has been working on it, but he unfortunately could not make this call today.
Sorry, what was the question again? Sorry, I got pinged by someone, so got distracted.
Like, so right now, if we're going to host our own private registry, we need to use ACR, but what's the roadmap for supporting any OCI compliant registry? Or at minimum, GitHub.
Oh, I think we will have to discuss on that. Currently, there's no plan or ETA for that, but I guess I need to sync with Marcin to figure out. I can get back to you offline. I'll put the answer in the chat once I figure out.
Cool, thank you.
No problem.
Thanks, Shimon. Bernie?
Yes, I just had a question around I guess the variable imports that we saw before. So I was just wondering, like, what happens if you have like from a symbol perspective, if you import into a like a document that then has some of the symbols in the from the like imported file. So I was just I guess wondering, does that work? Or is that a problem? So
Yeah, I can take that one. That does work. The exact thing that ends up in your compiled document depends on what kind of import you do. It's probably easier to show rather than tell. So I'm going to share my screen again. Okay. So we had this example where, not sure what I did. Oh yeah, deliberately included an error. Okay. So when we compiled this template, because it's referring to shape and small circle here, those symbols will actually be redefined in the ARM template themselves. For anything that's not explicitly imported by name, we assign it a name that won't conflict with any legal Bicep name. So the shape type definition refers to circle and rectangle. So those get pulled in as type definitions into our main.json file, but they just get assigned this name that won't conflict with anything that you've defined in your template. And if you pull in symbols that have the same name from multiple templates, those will also be disambiguated. Does that answer your question, Bernie?
yeah, cool. That's cool. Very good. Thanks, Johnny.
Chris?
Yeah, I was playing with the types and was wondering if there are any plans. I'm getting a weird echo here. Sorry.
Sorry, I just muted everyone. Chris, you'll have to unmute yourself again.
Okay, I'm just wondering with the types if there's any plans on being able to point a type at a part of an ARM or a resource in order to import it. So I think I was specifically playing with the app gateways and trying to create types for the sub-objects within there. And as you know, the sub-objects are awfully deeply nested, and there are arrays of information, which obviously make the types a little bit harder to deal with because you can't specify, or it's a little more challenging to say I want an array of an object. You have to actually go and create a sub-object and then say I want an array of that thing. So the concept, I guess, would be, if I look at something like a app gateway and I want to have a type that's based off of, for example, the backend pool, is there any way to do that other than me writing that myself? I mean, I'd like my type to actually say, oh, I'm using like a storage account parameter type or an app gateway dot backend pool type.
So there isn't right now, but it is something that we're working on. One thing that we're still trying to figure out is when you refer to a type that is part of an ARM resource, it's sort of a moving target, right? Because that type can evolve over time. So the thing we want to get right is when you say
what do you mean
it
can? What do you mean by it can evolve over time? I thought that was specified with the resource version.
That is true. You do version those resources, but there are certain changes that ARM considers to be backwards compatible. So a storage account resource, without changing its API version, could add an optional property, and that would be perfectly reasonable and valid to do. And I think ARM resources evolve in that way pretty frequently. And that's normally not a problem when you have a template that declares that resource directly, because the Bicep compiler, assuming you have your local copy up to date, should be using a fairly recent version of the ARM type, so it should know about all of the properties that have been publicly documented. And we want to make sure that the experience doesn't, or that we offer the same kind of experience for if you have a parameter and you say, I want this parameter to match a specific type taken from a subset of this ARM. What we want to figure out is, like, should that evolve over time? How do we, and if it is a moving target, how strictly do we want to enforce that in the ARM engine, in addition to in the Bicep compiler?
I mean, I would imagine that if we said, oh, I want a type of a storage account parameter based off of the version from 2022 11.11, that would be immutable. That version as defined in the ARM template would be what I would get for my type. Now, if you're saying that that's not necessarily true, I guess that could be a problem. But wouldn't it be simple to base that off of a version and then just be rubber stamped, chiseled in stone for the most part?
Right, but those types aren't immutable. They are. There is a pretty strong guarantee there of backwards compatibility, so that the promise that Azure resource providers are making is whatever changes they're going to make, they're not going to break your existing deployments. That doesn't mean they can't add new features to existing API versions.
Okay. I guess I'm misunderstanding what that version contract is giving us then.
Well, if a provider introduces a new API version, there could be breaking changes there. So you can't necessarily just blindly upgrade API versions. Sometimes there are behavior changes on the back end. Sometimes the shape itself changes in a way that we wouldn't consider backwards compatible. Within an API version, though, there are sort of defined evolutionary paths.
Okay.
Yeah,
I guess I would just assume that, again, I know that I can't just blindly change my version of my resource. I would assume that I would have the same thing with my my types, that I can't blindly assume that a type that I created with version, again, 22.11 would work with a resource that's 23.11.
Right,
so yeah,
right. So
just a thoughts.
Yeah. The scenario we're thinking of specifically is, the API version is set in stone. It's 2022 11.11. The resource provider, after you've written and published your template, adds an optional property. But you've already published your template that says my parameter is, a subtype of this resource, and somewhere in the type that you've captured, that optional property was added. Do you want your parameter to accept that optional property because it's supposed to track the resource type? Or should it have been set in stone, not based on the API version, but based on when you published your template? So those are the questions that we're still debating, how best to address that.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, it's just, again, I went through this exercise and decided that this would be a great thing to try. And it just turned out to be much, much harder to define these. No, I only had to define it once, but it was cumbersome. Okay, well, thank you.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks, Chris. Let me address some of the questions in chat first before we move on to the next person who has their hand up. Deployment/GA, we are definitely working on it. There have been a lot of things that have come up, but private preview is out, if I'm not mistaken. Cool. Then the next person, Christian.
Yeah. One question related to API versions of resources. We have some projects that have kind of grown over a few years, and there's like a sprawling amount of different API versions across the same types of resources. And it's kind of a bit hard to constantly go through and update API versions to kind of ensure that they're kind of the same, just for tidiness reasons. I think that's kind of tracked in the GitHub issue 622. Just wondering what the state of improving that is.
I can follow up with you offline on this, check in with engineers.
Cool, thank you.
That's good. Okay, as of the question, if someone from the AVM team can join the next call, Shenglong responded, but yes, let's try to get them on the next call. Hopefully they can answer some questions. All right, is there anything else? Any other questions that you guys have? Bernie?
I was just going to ask the community because I was doing an internal hack project like earlier in the month as well around DevOps. So I guess I just wanted for anybody from the community, if they want to share the on chat if we're done with the main questions, or or come off mute around like any specific challenges with DevOps. DevOps of Bicep, yeah.
Other than what if? Or inclusive of what?
So
Apparently
actually,
it's getting better.
I do have something that somebody asked. We were using hosted providers for can't remember what it was for. I think it was for Data Lake. And the agent runs as the network service. How do you install Bicep so that the actual Bicep can run? Since Bicep is installed as local users and not as a system, how do you get a system level install for Bicep other than what we did, which was copy it into a directory and alter the path for that? Yeah, or every single time your pipeline installs, you run the Bicep install.
Yeah, probably dumping the CLI and setting a path variable up somewhere is probably the main way.
But it's only a manual process.
Yeah, there's no installer. Yeah.
Because I think the way I solved it was, I mean, I would just do an AZ Bicep install and then pick the version I want, and that would install it for that user. Because it's not like it's a system level install, but it's like I mean, it's the user that's running your job.
It's a user, yeah. The challenge with that, of course, is that if you do AZ Bicep, that's only available for inside the AZ world versus outside of that. You can't just type bicep.exe at that point because it's only AZ Bicep.
Correct. It's not on the path. There was a GitHub action that did it that I started to use, but what I found was that some, like the AZ GitHub actions, don't necessarily use whatever you've got on the path, even though you tell it to. And there's some there's some quirkiness there. So the only thing that worked for me was AZ Bicep install, and nothing else really worked as I expected it.
Okay.
The way that
But then
we
once
got
you know
around
where it is, if you're running a Linux build, then it's going to be under your AGCLI folder, and you can add that to the path. If you know where it's going to be.
This was a Windows. I mean, Linux is not going to be as much of a deal because you can obviously work with it, but this was specifically a Windows install with a service, that application, that agent running as a network. It was running as a network credentials as opposed to a real user.
Yeah, the way that we got around it is if you copy the Bicep executable into the System32 folder, then every user, it's in the path for every user.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, you can also do an ACL and clear all writes on everything and it'll work, but nobody wants to do that.
Yeah, I mean, what I would imagine is you'd want to take the kind of the approach that's take with like the runner, the kind of ephemeral runners, where everything you need has to be in your working folder. And so you either come up with a way to set up a tool cache the way it's done on the runners and download any of the command line tools you need. If you're using Terraform, if you're using Bicep, if you're using something else that's portable, then have a strategy for putting them in a place and then adding them to a path. Because I think that's the safest way that I would approach it, especially if you're going to use like a system level permission, a system level like identity.
No, and that's exactly what we did. We ended up, as part of the pipeline, every single install, it would every time the pipeline ran, it made sure that the Bicep stuff was available.
Like the tricky thing would be if you had a system level install of Bicep, then at what point, like if you had to install it as part of that pipeline, then the path wouldn't affect you until you restart your agent, unless you were able to, at that point, actively add it to your path. And then everything past that point would have the new path.
Yeah, there's all just, it was just weird. I mean, because it's it's an MSI installer, and typically you see an MSI installer, you say run it in admin mode, and there's no option to do that. So we were just confused.
You can override I thought the installer would let you override the destination, like using the parameters. I don't know if anyone has any documentation on it, but otherwise you have to dig into the installer source and see how it's set up. But usually what you can do with MSIs are you can override, like, okay, I want to install it for all users, but I want to put it in this folder. And then sometimes it'll do the right thing if the installer is set up to do that, but sometimes they don't support that.
I just don't think the installer is set up to do that correctly. But again, because it's available just through an executable, that's what we ended up doing, is that we just downloaded the executable.
It's easier.
Yeah, it's just had to get it working, so we weren't waiting for a solution, we were waiting for a fix.
Awesome. Thank you.
A problem that I had recently, I don't know if anyone else has had this, but when doing subscription level deployments where you've got to pass everything as modules, I was creating a module for Key Vault secrets, and when I wanted to output the secret URI and reference that in my main deployment file, it didn't like referencing the output of the secret URI. It was saying the only outputs you could have was tenant ID and all the properties that were for a Key Vault. I don't know if anyone else has come across that issue before. Judging by the radio silence.
So as a general practice, you usually don't want to include secrets in deployment outputs because those aren't necessarily stored with the same access controls that the secrets themselves would be. But you can always pass identifiers for the Key Vault and then give those back to your main module and then have the main module call into the key vault to retrieve that value when it's needed.
Yeah, so I wasn't actually outputting the secret itself. I was outputting the secret URI, which is effectively like the URL connection string to the key vault secret. So should be secure. It was like Bicep had a bug in it where it couldn't actually really read the properties of that. I can raise it on the GitHub page if need be.
Yeah, I would recommend raising it in GitHub. Okay, are there any other questions? I'm not sure, Bernie, if that answered what you wanted or
Yeah, no, that was
satisfactory.
helpful. Yeah, that's fine. All good.
Great.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, I guess then we can end it here. I will upload the community call by next Monday. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.